Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on the Project Foundries podcast today. We're delighted to have Adam Kazan from New eIDAS. He's one of our strategic partners that works with us on identity and financial payments on an advisory capacity. So Adam is going to give us a whistle-stop tour on the European Digital Identity Wallet and all things identity for the new world that we're living in. We're really excited to have you, Adam. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
Brilliant. So maybe, Adam, if we want to start off maybe talking about what digital identity actually is, if you can tell the viewers what that actually means to them in a real world capacity and how we're looking at it in a different way now.
Yep. So look, I suppose in simple terms, digital identity is taking bits and pieces of information about ourselves and creating a means or a vehicle for us to identify ourselves in digital world. In a traditional sense, that's very much undertaking a registration or an onboarding process where we provide maybe our name, our address, our date of birth. Combined on that information, the service provider will, proof that identity is correct and that I am who I say I am. And then they'll issue me with access credentials. And the combination of those access credentials and the information they're attached to for that organization represents the digital identity. And I suppose, look, interestingly, as digital identity has evolved across quite a long period of time on the internet, we've seen the emergence of identities that are very much provided on a one-to-one basis from a service provider into an individual. We'd be all very familiar with that. So when I open a bank account, I undergo a process of identity verification checks. The bank has a legal compliance obligation to make sure that they proof my identity to a very high standard. And only when they've proved that identity to a high standard, they issue access credentials. So I have a reasonable level of confidence that Adam is Adam if I'm a bank. Okay. Conversely, if I'm buying something online from a retailer really only cares about taking the payment, shipping the goods, and they care about my address. So they don't really proof my identity to the same extent. They take my word that my address is my address. Okay. Tied into the payment process, perhaps they do have a means of making sure that the card details I've given are attached to my home address, and that protects them. So we would have a very low level of trust in relation to certain identities and a very high level of trust in relation to other identities. So that's really where identity evolved from. And then lately, we've probably become very accustomed to social media login. So you'll be aware, Facebook, Google, Apple even, I can log into different service providers using their identity services that are integrated into my smartphone. So I have an account with Apple, I have Apple ID, it links my email address, I can include address information, etc., and I can use that when I'm checking out to identify myself and share information with a whole host of Apple's partners, similar for Google, similar for Facebook. That gives me, I suppose, a level of reusability of my identity, which I don't have when I'm normally operating on a one-to-one basis, but a very low level of trust. A bank, for example, would never rely on a social media login to allow me to log into their service. And that's really where digital identity has evolved from, and where it is now, and where it's going. I guess we're going to talk about the rest of the podcast is the European Digital Identity Wallet.
Okay, fab. And I think it's those real world examples that really sort of sink home for us all, because I worked in identity management within the HSE and how we identified patients, and that rapidly changing world of how you moved from the identifying patients in the world that we were living in to a new world that we're all actually operating in. And when you think about like Google and Facebook, it's become quite natural just to verify your identity through that process. And I think it's maybe even, and we're going to do loads of three-letter acronyms that we will absolutely make sure somebody points out to us. So we'll make sure and try and get them all. But that identity management, when you're going through that process, you don't think of it really anymore as identity management. You think of it more as a convenience thing to, I'll click my Google because it'll fill in all the details and it stops me having to do the work then as well.
Yeah, it's kind of terrible, isn't it? Because we don't think about it, you're right, but we certainly fall into the trap of there's a bit of consumerism about it. There's a bit of we've got used to convenience, wanting things instantly on demand. I don't want to read the warning buttons or signs. I want to just enter all the information I need to enter. If it's contained in a cookie, I don't care what it is. I'll just check my shipping address correct and I'll share it. So whatever is convenient. And interestingly, that's led into a situation where you and I and the average internet user actually has our identity information scattered across the globe, scattered across service providers we use. There's numerous pieces of research out there that show our identity for the average online user is with 600 service providers or more. Now, that's if you stop and pause and think about that for a moment, that's ridiculous, right? So think about the security breaches that we hear about all the time. We receive emails from service suppliers to say that they've had a breach and our data has been compromised. But to your point, do you really care? It depends on what that information is used for. You only really care when there's an impact to you. So somebody has managed to take over your identity, open a bank account, withdraw credit, and next thing you're going to knock on the door from a lender looking for money that you haven't drawn down or taken, but rather a fraudster has. And I suppose the other thing about all of your service providers is that they all conform with different levels of security. So they're protecting your information differently. Your information, bits and pieces of it, there could be an awful lot of information with these service providers or very minimum information. But if somebody manages to stitch together different sets of information, they can do a lot of damage with it. And if we think about, I suppose, going back to the scenario around how the internet evolved on a one-to-one basis and social media login, think about all these service providers having to implement some form of identity access management or identity verification. They're very costly controls. It's a very costly business to be an identity. It begs the question, why isn't there somebody out there, a central entity, a government, providing a verified, trusted identity that people can leverage and rely on?
And I think that's sort of what we're here to talk about today as well, isn't it? It's like, where are we going to? And that 600 accounts, like when we were talking about that earlier on today, I was like, oh my God. And then I went, actually, you can see over the number of years how that would all those different accounts would build up. And I was joking with you even about my son having multiple identities for his PlayStation and then his, what's the other one called? PlayStation, and then there's the other one.
Xbox,
that one. Both at different stages. And about him and all his wee friends talking about starting up different accounts and just new accounts, new identity information, forgetting their passwords, not knowing where anything is. And I'm laughing as you're talking about the financial information, because all the financial information attached to every account of Sean's is mine. So he is there running away with all these different identities and financial information.
He doesn't mind.
No, he doesn't mind. He definitely doesn't. But it's a different world that we're moving into. So talk to us a little bit more about how the identity world and the European digital identity wallet legislation, explain to us a little bit more about what that is.
Yeah, so I suppose before we take a direct shift into that, to build on the reusable identities that social media companies provide, there are, of course, digital identity schemes across Europe and other markets globally, in Canada and Japan and Singapore, who have created digital identity schemes for trusted reusable digital identities in those markets, where you have a central federated control mechanism, be it a government or public-private partnership, or maybe it's private, could be banking, where they're working together to proof the identities of citizens and residents in those markets, and then issue digital identities that can be used in an ecosystem of relying parties to be able to log in, much in the way that you can with Google, Facebook and Apple, right? So it's that ecosystem of partners who the central entity trust and allow, for a fee of course, to be able to confirm that Maria is Maria and that Maria can authenticate a transaction, or Maria can use her digital identity to log into various different services. But you have to be part of that ecosystem. Bringing on that a level, the European Digital Identity Wallet seeks to enhance that further, because in that federated model similar to Google and Apple, you have one central party that controls the collection of identity information, be it low trust non-verified or high trust verified in the case of some of those schemes. And to name some of those schemes, I guess you've got Bank ID in Sweden, which is also in Norway now. You've got It's Me in Belgium. You've got MitID in Denmark. Estonia have Estonia ID.
Yeah.
And these schemes have achieved really high levels of penetration among citizens. So Estonia is close to 100%, actually, believe it or not. So it's 99,
Estonia
almost
are
touching on.
incredible. Even their digital health is unreal.
Yeah, they're very, very far ahead of everybody else.
Yeah.
Similarly with It's Me, I think it's up in the high 60s, 70%, maybe touching on 80% at the moment.
And it actually skyrocketed during COVID as well, from an identity management point of view, for like COVID and test and trace.
Because the COVID passes embedded into it, etc.
Exactly, they're incredible work.
So the difference with the European Digital Identity Wallet is to take the successes of those schemes and to create a European-wide scheme. With each member state, so each government, including Ireland, to go and create a digital identity wallet, which quite simply is a mobile app sitting on a phone or a smart device where you load your digital identity into. And we go back and we think about that user journey, and we talked about onboarding with a one-to-one service provider like a bank. So the government in the digital identity scheme will be responsible for verifying citizens' identity to a very, very high level of assurance. So there's all sorts of rules and standards that will play out across Europe. All governments have to comply with. Once they have verified your identity, they'll give you a digital version of that identity. So effectively user access credentials, etc. You'll download the digital identity app in your member state. So we believe the Irish government will provide it for Ireland.
And just when you say user access credentials, I suppose just to explain, that's similar to what we use now for mobile banking and that kind of thing. So it's that same kind of process and format.
Exactly, yeah. So think of the whole onboarding, screening. I believe MyGovID is still face-to-face setting in government offices or local offices, etc., that are recognised to perform the identity verification process. That'll most likely move into an online environment or face-to-face, depending on what method the government wants to use. But they'll have to assure the identity to a very high level. Now, when we're talking about the identity information and attributes, we're talking about a very small core minimum set of data, most likely name, address, date of birth, probably your PPS number or whatever social security number a government in Europe has issued to their citizens.
In health, it used to be your core 4+1.
Okay.
So it was your first name, surname, your address, your date of birth, and then one other identifying factor, which of the PPSN would have been one of them, or your mobile phone, which is also a really high way of actually identifying you from a data set point of view as well.
Very good.
Yeah.
And from that point, that minimum set of data attached to your digital identity the government has issued will be known as the PID, the Person Identification Data. So if there's one of the acronyms. There's one. And we made sure we explained it as well.
Do bingo if you want to have a drink, you can have a drink every time.
But when I download the app, similarly, when I download a mobile banking app, I then need to be able to bind that identity to the mobile app on my mobile device. And there'll be a secure mechanism for doing that. Once I've loaded the identity, the identity is live on the digital identity wallet on my phone. And from there, I'll be able to use the phone to identify myself to what we call relying parties. So that's anyone that's connected that wants to confirm my identity. Those relying parties will have to be onboarded, so there'll be a scheme around that. So if I'm a bank, for example, that wants to use and avail of the digital identity in order to prove the identity of Maria when she wants to open a bank account, I will be able to integrate to the digital identity wallet, get the government to certify I've done that integration correctly, or the wallet provider will do that, and thereafter be able to identify myself during that process. Now, there's a very minimum set of data that the bank can benefit from, because the PID, the person identification data, contains very little information. So it's not going to satisfy all of the onboarding KYC requirements a bank has. So looking at banks, for example, and being involved in the financial services sector, we tested a few different banks, digital native banks, and then also the traditional banks here in Ireland. And they, believe it or not, look for upwards of 50 to 60 pieces of data when you onboard with them. You just want to open a current account. So not all that data will be there. But what will be there is the ability for the bank or another service provider to prove your identity almost unequivocally, to say Maria is Maria.
Very high level of trust.
So what does that mean? That means as a bank or another type of institution, I no longer have to perform the identity proofing, the video selfie check, the showing the passport, those controls, which will reduce costs. Utility bills, etc. Provided the information that the bank needs is within the wallet. And that probably brings us nicely to the nice part of the wallet, and the real core difference with the eID schemes, traditional EI schemes that are in the market, like It's Me, etc. This is a decentralized model. So comparatively to federated being a central entity responsible for onboarding and proofing the information that they attach to the identity to be included in the wallet. Decentralized model, as the EU DIW will be the government minimum core data having verified your identity in the wallet, but then an ecosystem of trusted service providers who be certified and integrated into the wallet to share other information that they hold about you. So think about education. So universities, colleges, HETAC will be able to push your educational qualifications into the wallet. Professional certification bodies will be able to push into the wallet. You'll have travel companies will be able to push airline tickets. You'll have government will be able to push your visa and eligibility to travel and work in different markets and so on and so forth. So this ecosystem is somewhat, I would think, boundless over time, that it could be literally anybody. That ecosystem, if you think about the government and the PID, the government will have to assure the information they push into the wallet to a very high level of assurance. So real certainty over Maria's name is correct, Maria's date of birth is correct, etc., etc. Similarly, these trust service providers will be able to push information to the wallet and attach a level of assurance to that information, so that everybody in the ecosystem that uses or relies on that information, when I as a user decide to share with them, is certain around how trusted that information is, to the level that it has been verified. Very high level of assurance down to low level of assurance. And then the relying party being able to, in effect, decide what is the use case, or what's the use and purpose of which I'm attaching to the information that I'm going to use, and how strongly can I trust it? Do I need to still collect it from the customer? So it's a really exciting initiative. I think if we think about the comparison to existing federated, which we don't even have here in Ireland. If you think about social media, what you're going to have is a trusted, verified and reusable digital identity that you can almost use anywhere in time.
It's very exciting, but as you talk about all those different components to it as well, I know, because I worked on the health app, which is in production at the moment in the HSE with my two amazing colleagues, Gar and Ben. And one of the big things that we were very aware of was the communication to this to citizens around your information, because there's a lot of different people and organisations in that ecosystem you're speaking about. They have lots of different types of data about you, etc. as well. I'd love for you to chat a little bit more about the decentralisation of the data and how it actually is privacy enhancing, because I find this very, very exciting. As a citizen, I thought this was fabulous.
Yeah, and probably not everybody will. Aware of in the earlier stages of the eIDAS regulation is what this is formally called. The European Digital Identity Wallet is what it's become more known as. In the Netherlands, there was protests around potential overextension of government reach and suspicion and concern and worry amongst citizens, and maybe an agenda pushed by the far left or far right, depending which country you're in, that actually what's happening here is the government is going to have a big brother view of what we're doing, who we're engaging with, what data we're sharing, and lots of information about us that we don't really want them to have access to. The decentralized model, and without getting technical on this, effectively the information we talk about and that ecosystem of trust service providers that sit outside the wallet, which is in the middle, you and you alone. Well, a few things. One, you decide, do I want a digital identity? It's completely optional. It's not going to be mandated. So every citizen has a choice. Do I want one? If you get a digital identity, you decide then, do you want a digital identity wallet, and whom from? In that market in Ireland, it might be the government plus a couple of others. Depends on what the Irish government decide around that. And then the information that you hold in the wallet is completely at your discretion. So I can go out to Bank A and say, I'd like some of my financial statements in there, or I want your proof of my address in there, or I can go out to someone else and say, I want you to push information in. And then it's also completely at my discretion who I share the information with. But the important thing is nobody has a view of how that information is passed to, who is passed to.
Exactly.
Each of the think about the decentralized nodes of those trust service providers hold the information. They push it to the wallet. Only the user can determine who it shares it with, and nobody has line of sight of how it's used, when it's used, and who it's shared with. Now, that creates maybe a challenge in one sense, depending on your point of view in this.
Yeah.
Insofar as everybody's going to want to make something out of this, right?
Yeah.
If I'm a trust service provider, will I want to provide that information to my customer's wallet to share on with other third parties? If it has a commercial value attached to it that I actually can't quantify how many times or with whom the customer is sharing it, to be able to charge for that. And not charge the customer, because actually a very important point we should have said, the whole initiative in the legislation, there's no cost to the consumer.
No cost,
There's a commercial opportunity for businesses for sure to charge one another.
Yes.
But we need to figure out a mechanism as to how they're going to be able to figure out how much data that I'm sharing is being shared with others in the ecosystem, and it may not be possible.
Yeah.
So then the question probably comes more to a good in the general ecosystem. If you're sharing information and others are sharing information, is a mutual benefit of exchange of that data. Down the line, maybe it's a karma type thing. If I share information and someone else's information that's noteworthy or of importance to me, to enhance my business value proposition and make things easier for my customer, I might be willing to share just to make sure that the ecosystem is enticed to come in and share, because the more data that's available, everybody benefits. The customer, the government, the service providers. Because you got to think about the core minimum data and the purpose that identity data provides in isolation, simply to prove your identity, to authenticate Maria as Maria, to log into services. But actually the richness in this is we have this really rich ecosystem of a variety of different service providers that Maria interacts with that is sharing that information that others can benefit from as well.
Yeah. And I suppose from listening to that, and I suppose the work that I did do in the HSE from the health app perspective, I would look at it from a patient or citizen perspective going, I have more control over my data.
Yep.
And for example, when we looked at it for health, it was like if you were going to a service that only needed to know your date of birth, that you were over 18, that you as a patient did not have to give all the information about who you were, where you lived. Sometimes you don't want to give that information depending on the different services you're receiving, but you could just prove that you're over 18. Yep. So from that citizen perspective, it's that control over data that I think is really important. From the business and commercial perspective, I think that's very interesting, and it's exciting to look at the new model of what that looks like, with the fact that it's extremely privacy enhancing and protecting for the person that owns the data. And I think it's that key that businesses and organizations will have the opportunity to look at really amazing new ways of actually commercializing the process that they're engaging in. But the core foundation is that data is, for me as a person, is much more secure, much more safe. And that, I think, is really exciting.
It is, and I suppose Europe is all about privacy with GDPR coming in quite a long time ago at this stage, and like really good points. I think fundamentally having greater control over who I can share my information with and where I source it from and what I put value on, and then who I want to share it with, is one aspect of the digital identity wallet. Slightly tangential to that, the wallet from a functional perspective will give me a view of who I've shared information with. So think about our 600 service providers today. I've no idea where my data is, who it's with, how I revoke it, what they're using it for, and probably 400 of those service providers and more I've only used once and will never use again. So in the new world, the digital identity wallet would allow me to have a view of that, and importantly have a feature to revoke that data as well. But I think just some of your points as well, there's a real point of inflection for businesses to think carefully about what information they should hold about customers or need to hold about customers. Because if I have a trusted authority that's telling me Maria is over X age, she lives here, her name is, her PPSN number is, and some other information, do I need that just to onboard Maria, or do I need to store it? Can I pull it from the wallet in the future point in time? Because if you think about the data you're storing today, you have lots of information about customers, possibly too much. And if you have the ability to effectively leave that data somewhere else that you can access it, but then reduce your risk if you had a breach that really sensitive information is stolen, then that's possibly a vehicle for you go forward to reduce risk, operational risk, etc., around cyber threats and security, and what the implications of those might be to business. Now, that's notwithstanding, some industries may be legally compelled to hold that information.
Yes.
And therein lies the rub with this digital identity wallet. Across Europe, different, let's say, transpositions of different legislations and different interpretations, different member states will require a real thorough review by the government, and they may need to amend some. So, for example, the Anti-Money Laundering Directive in Ireland requires institutions to hold copies of documentation they use to prove the identity.
Yeah.
In the new world, in theory, that shouldn't be necessary, because I'm going to digitally prove that Maria is Maria, and I've done my IDV and checks, and if I have a record that securely shows that, unequivocally shows rather, that I have done that with the digital identity wallet, then why do I need to store all the data and capture the data? So there's a huge customer convenience aspect to this. Customer experience will be enhanced. I'll go back to that bank example earlier, 50 plus pieces of information. So again, the person identification data, 4 or 5 core attributes, not going to satisfy the 40 or 50 pieces of information, but with a rich ecosystem, I might just get a lot of providers' data through the wallet, shared with the customer, via the customer, that allow me to satisfy 40, 45 pieces of data, which really means that I have very little keying of data. I can onboard much quicker, reduce the cost on the service provider side, and satisfy the customer at the end of the day much quicker.
It's fab, and it's so interesting as well. Even if you look at businesses not having to hold that data, and as the lead in Project Foundry around data and digital solutions, and that retention of data and the governance of data, and how you actually look at auditing data, and that could change that. Obviously, it'll take a number of years for this all to move forward, but that would change even how you're actually looking at identifiable information for every organisation going forward from even that perspective. And that aspect around legislation and governance across EU is like, that's that macro look about how you actually do it from an EU level. But then even within Ireland itself, there's different legislations against different government bodies as well. So there is a complexity to this that is going to be an interesting one to watch how we do it for the best view for the citizen, and how you can actually service the citizen. And again, commercial organisations being aware and understanding that complexity is going to be really interesting as well. Okay, so tell us a little bit more about the timeline for the European Digital Identity Wallet, and what that looks like, from how we're going to get there, or how we're going to move there.
Yeah, and I suppose when we get into the specific timelines around the initiative and who has to do what and when, like the original eIDAS directive, because this is eIDAS 2, came in 2014, right? So off the back of that, the Irish government implemented MyGovID, right? So the foundations are there. It's an important point that we're building on. It's a big transformation to get to a digital identity wallet and a decentralized solution at that. But the core requirements really are, if we break them down, the government, each member state, so the Irish government need to provide a mechanism to create a PID, do the identity verification of the customer to a high level of assurance, and issue a digital identity that conforms with the standards under eIDAS. They also need to make sure that in Ireland there is a compliant wallet that's interoperable across Europe. Right? So I can take my Irish wallet when it's issued and my PID, which is included in the wallet, and use that any member state. So your Irish wallet and your personal identifiable information can be used in any country. Yeah. Okay. So if I travel to another state as let's say a student, that I can engage with public services and use the wallet for private services in that market, open a bank account, etc. Right? Because I'm maybe a short-term resident, or maybe it's long-term, but I need to be able to use my Irish wallet. But conversely, other member states' wallets need to work in Ireland too. The third part is that the government needs to create that ecosystem for governance and organisation, certification, and they may decide to stand up bodies within the public sector themselves, or they may partner with private industry to do that, but they got to govern the whole thing. So you got to go back to the point around, I'm a bank, I want to use this wallet. I need to integrate, I need to certify, and I need to conform with certain standards. If I'm a trust service provider providing data into the wallet, again, I need to show that I am verifying the data to a high level of assurance, or whatever level of assurance I'm claiming, get that certified and maintain those standards, and someone has to have oversight of that.
Yeah.
So they're the three things the government has to do, and the legislation actually came in, was adopted by the European Council in May, just passed, and from there there's a set of implementing acts that need to come, which gives the level 2 text. That's coming expected November this year, and some into next year, and it's 24 months from that point before the government has to have those things in place we talked about a moment ago. So you're looking at probably November 2026, maybe December 2026 for the government. So what's that mean? That means you and I will have access to a wallet, be able to get this digital identity from that point, and be able to use it with public services. Then, cleverly, like any product, you need a two-sided market. You need somebody provide a service, but you need the customer to want it, and then you need to be able to use that product or service widely in order to want to adopt it. They're creating that demand by having the government stand up the service, and then on the other side they're going to legislate a whole host of private relying parties to accept the wallet. So I'd be able to use it with public, but I don't engage government too often, right? So I do my taxes and maybe health. Some people use social security, etc. But you're not engaging the government on a more than maybe a monthly basis for most people, I would think. So to drive the usage, they're mandating financial services to accept it. So specifically for onboarding, so it'll have equivalence with, presenting a passport for onboarding, opening an account, so opening a bank account, but also to log in, and then also to perform authentication to a strong level. So in the bank space, we would see, when you get redirected from your merchant's website to your mobile phone to authenticate a transaction, in the future you'd be able to opt with your bank that you want your digital identity wallet to do that. Which is really interesting because, I have accounts with 2 or 3 banks, credit card, debit card, and I have different user experiences to be able to do everything in the one wallet, one experience in the future. But the other industries to be mandated are health, there's water, there's education, there's travel, social media, really interesting one to our conversation earlier.
This is interesting. I'd love to even talk about this a little bit more as well, because I think it's quite, and I will come back then to what we're doing in Ireland and what other countries are doing as well, because I think that would be really interesting to talk about. But the social media aspect, you mentioned before around using identity to basically verify, for example, when we were talking about health and your age, and then you were talking about the fact that the law may change around social media for under 16s, and what does that look like then from an identity perspective?
Well, I suppose it's a hot topic at the moment, isn't it? It's been in the national broadsheets in the recent 2 to 3 weeks around the government thinking about bringing in age restrictions on the use of social media and how harmful the content is. And as we know in the financial services space, a lot of fraud originates from social media platforms. So people misrepresenting themselves, there's romance fraud, there's trying to fish information from people. And the thing about social media is, to the point earlier on, they don't verify your identity to a high level of assurance, and most of them don't really verify your identity at all. You are who you say you are to them. So I could be masquerading as anybody. So what the digital identity wallet and the eIDAS legislation is doing is compelling those platforms to allow customers to rely on the digital identity wallet to prove their identity. So in tandem with potential, well, we don't know if it'll happen, legislation around age restrictions in different markets or maybe European-wide, the digital identity wallet could become a vehicle for, if you imagine anyone who's over 16 who has access to digital identity wallet, what you're going to quite quickly see in social media platforms is, I can see verified accounts and non-verified accounts. And it's funny, Elon Musk, when he took over Twitter, now X, talked about verified accounts and the blue tick, right? He was onto something. As crazy as he sometimes appears, but he was onto something, and having a government verified identity for social media and for all these other services definitely, I think, not only enhances the convenience and user experience that customers can have, but can help protect protect our children, protect us
Yeah.
from fraud, crime, abuse, online bullying, all that sort
Yeah.
of stuff. So it's really interesting.
It could have a huge impact in that world. And I worked many years ago for a startup called Zico. They're not a startup anymore. They're doing incredible. And it was all around cyberbullying and how to actually educate your kids to basically do the right thing when things happened and protect themselves and friends, and that identity of who you were actually dealing with online and not ever really knowing. So it could really impact that for content creation, access to different social media platforms, which is very interesting. Back to what's happening now within Ireland. But before we jump into Ireland, can you tell us anything about any other countries and who's doing anything interesting or what's happening around the European Digital Identity Wallet?
We forgot actually to close out the other point. My fault. You asked what's happening when. So
what's
the
happening
one
when?
date we didn't mention, we mentioned the Irish government 2026, end of 2026.
November.
12 months after the Irish government makes the wallet available. The private relying parties we mentioned earlier on, so banks, health and so on and so forth, need to accept the wallet. So that's onboard and integrate and start to allow citizens to use the wallet for those purposes that we mentioned earlier on. So that's a key point. There's a lot of the listeners may be in those spaces. With regards to other markets, so we're seeing a lot of markets. We mentioned earlier on the governments have a choice to make. Do we provide our own wallet? Do we partner with private industry to provide a wallet? Or do we provide our own wallet and we allow private industry to provide a wallet? Will there be multiple markets or wallets in each market? Those decisions aren't clear in many markets. Although what we do see is governments are responding very positively and quickly to the mandate that they have and the obligation they have to put wallets in place, and they're starting to build their own wallets. So certainly what we expect to see is at least one wallet in every single market, probably in most markets issued by the government. But you could have a situation where you have multiple wallets in different markets too. So I think automatically to maybe some of those markets where there's digital identity, national digital identity schemes in place through public-private partnership or private, that they may look to get certified. So in some of those markets you may have multiple wallets. What that means is for Ireland, again going back to the point around cross-border interoperability, we'll have to, anyone who's accepting the wallet will have to accept wallets from every market. Is the understanding at the moment. Some markets are getting quite active around public-private collaboration, because the key thing, if you think about governments acting independently and standing up the wallet, and very focused, some may say in some cases myopically focused, understandably, to make it work for public services. They forget there's actually different industries who will need to connect to this, who are going to be legislated to connect to it, use it, who will have very different customer propositions, different customer journeys, different needs and need to be catered for. Now, thankfully, at a European level, compared to some other legislations that we've seen in the recent past, where there's tended to be a let's legislate and let's leave it to industry to decide on how they're going to develop the solutions. The Commission has invested quite a lot of money in working in partnership with private industry and public to stand up 4 large-scale pilots that are looking at different use cases. As part of those pilots, they have been developing an architecture reference framework, which effectively is how are we going to implement standards and technology around solving for these use cases that we've said we'll open up. And coming out of that, the industry is collaborating to develop pilots. So that's pilot wallets that they're testing. They're running hackathons. There was a hackathon in Germany a week or two ago where they're testing these on a basis of competition, and they're creating a lot of excitement around the wallet. So there's a lot of work going on in many of the markets. A lot of innovation, and there's I think last look there was over 360 entities involved in that. Now, sadly, there actually isn't many from Ireland. There's only a couple. So what we'd love to see is probably more participation in that from Irish institutions. and you can be any institution. You don't have to be someone who's going to build a wallet, but you can be a relying party. You can be, one of the technical service providers that's going to underpin the infrastructure. The government itself are involved in one of the pilots, but I think there's more need to create that momentum and discussion here. A lot of the clients that I would speak to, and I'm sure you guys would speak to as well, know very little about this. Some of the ones that are really impacted, like the banks, are only starting to kind of have that discussion internally now and mobilise around it. So we need that kind of cross-industry collaboration with government in particular to start to help people understand there's lots of things and decisions still to be made around how it's going to work, when it's going to be available. They've got to integrate and test and understand those use cases.
And lots of opportunities. And I suppose if we look even at what's happening in Ireland at the moment, and like I would get very excited about this because I was involved in bringing the health app with Gar, McChrista and Bren Clooney to the HSE, and we were massively supported by the OGCIO, the Office of Government CIO, Barry Lowry and Tony Shannon, and they are doing incredible work in the OGCIO for this digital wallet for Ireland. So I would be very proud and say we're actually going at a pace, I think, that's much faster than a lot of other countries. And within the OGCIO and within health, they are, like OGCIO are piloting. There's at the moment with government employees as well, which we're talking about the architectural reference framework that's been happening across Europe and people looking at what that looks like. Well, and I'm like, well, Ireland are way ahead and they've been doing stuff for the last 2 years. So I think that's really exciting for Ireland to be grabbing this and trying to move forward to support citizens with that privacy enhancing decentralisation of them actually owning their data and moving forward. From both a government perspective and then from the health perspective. Amazing, incredible work being done on an app there. And again, it will go live this year. And like you were talking about November 2026, and I just get very Ireland Inc. proud because we're doing some really good stuff now before that. And what it looks like for the future is very exciting to see where we where we can go as well.
Yeah, certainly. From what I've seen and some of the press release announcements and hearing you talk about it before and now, it looks like the government are making really good progress. And the development of a wallet that they've been testing and piloting, I think. Reading one of the press releases back in June from one of the ministers, Ussi and Smith.
That's it.
They were testing with over 1,000 employees in government. So that's brilliant progress. And Ireland potentially are in an incredible position because a lot of markets have mobile identity apps. They have a lot of infrastructure. They have a lot to unwind to try and implement this. You could consider that Ireland just somewhat greenfield and actually could press ahead and take advantage and play a real leading role in this. And as the only English-speaking common law country left in Europe, we could be leading lights in this. And the initiative as well to have a decentralised identity scheme and infrastructure across Europe is unique across global markets in terms of certainly where it is and how close it is to going live and the size of markets as well. So Europe are really leading the charge on this across the globe. So hopefully Ireland can do that across the member states as well.
It's really, really exciting, and it is working in a technical world and in a IT world for so long within the health services I've spoken to you about, it is complex. So it is complex of how you actually do the interoperability and how the data flows and the privacy, but it's very, very exciting. But I think there's lots more to talk about with this as well. I think we spoke about before, possibly doing more use cases, more examples of what customer journeys look like, to try and showcase to people a little bit more what that looks like in a real life scenario as well. I think would be a really positive thing to do.
So there's use cases for organisational IDs. So that's business to business verification. Now it needs to be worked through how that will work in practice. And most likely, I think it's employees belonging to an organisation who have a digital identity but are authorised on behalf of a business to act on their behalf.
That's interesting because when I was identity management director within the health services, we were looking at like the identity for people, but also organisation services, locations, and then identity even as people, as in like you may identify as Adam that works in X, but when you also then move to another hospital and you're also working in Y, and the multiple identities you can have as an employee. So that's actually really, really interesting.
For sure. And look, in Ireland compared to other markets, like we're quite poor around having services that allow us to prove the identity of individuals or businesses as well.
Okay.
You know, we don't have those real strong repositories of B2B type verification tools as well. So it certainly steps in there. The other areas, obviously access to government services, as we spoke about earlier, but prescriptions in your space in health is really interesting.
So that's been looked at, but I know it was one of the key findings when we started looking this September 2021. Prescriptions was one of the ones that myself, Gar and Ben were looking at and bringing to our senior leaders at that stage to say, how do we look at that better? My boss at the time, Joe Ryan, looked after like a e-prescription project as well. So massively, when I think of my dad and when we go on holidays, my mum takes multiple pictures of his prescriptions, then she emails them to herself, then she sends the pictures all to us as well. So to be able to have that information that is safe and secure and really, really clear on a HSE app is incredible. Yeah,
and that's probably a mainstream use case, but even, you know, I'm sure hopefully it rarely happens, but if I go into a pharmacist and I have a mechanism to prove my identity and it gets attached to a prescription that's ready for me instead of my medicine being handed out to you accidentally, right? So you can tighten all of those kind of controls and processes up as well. Education, we mentioned earlier, health is another use case. Signing contracts apparently is going to be for free as well, so a capability in the wallet to sign agreements, legal agreements digitally.
Is that like if you're purchasing different like houses or cars?
Yeah, in the bank context it could be signing your application or your terms conditions or signing drawdown for mortgage. You know, SIM registration, so SIM card registration, so for a number, obviously a degree of anonymity there. And again, optional, but there's value in it. And for me, look, the digital identity wallet, I'm really excited about it because I see it as a Apple Wallet on steroids, where I can hold everything. There's really nice user experience, that I can have my payment credentials with the use cases that are emerging from the initial go live that are targeted for go live, plus the promise of what's to come beyond that. It's something I could see me using every day, maybe multiple times during the day. And the important thing as well, we're talking about digital, but we forget actually the wallet is intended for face-to-face use as well.
Yes, exactly.
So I saw a video demo of what that might look like in a doctor's appointment context. So doctor has an app on their phone, you have a QR code, they use it to scan you are who you are and also exchange maybe some information around you. Maybe it's a new doctor you're going to for the first time, etc. So
that's how we looked at it originally, even within the HSE when we were doing customer journeys. And for me, that was massively powerful from a privacy perspective as well. So we looked at it within the COVID vaccination services, and every encounter you would have with most health encounters, you're very often saying, my name is, my address is.
Yeah, and repeating,
your date of birth, which half the time you don't want anyone to hear, and all that personal information being said quite loud, and the fact that you're able then just to use that, and we talked about the scanning of the QR code and passing the information needed as opposed to all of your information that's not needed. So I think that's really exciting. But you could go down, the more you think about it and the more you get into a business and have a conversation probably with a business themselves, the opportunities are endless. It just takes time, I think, to really consider it.
It does, and what we're seeing from initial conversations is like a general lack of understanding, and then when that understanding evolves, you naturally get pockets of misaligned understanding, which can lead to some misinformation. So I think that the first step, my recommendation would be understand, right, and get people that can help you understand, that have some authority on the subject. And then start to think about impacts. Think about the impacts from that baseline understanding on your organisation, your customer value propositions, and importantly your customer journeys, and from your customer journeys into back office operations, because a big value in this is in streamlining processes, taking cost out. And you commented earlier, and you're spot on. This isn't going to be all singing, all dancing the day it arrives. That ecosystem and the real value will only come in as trust service providers come on board. It's going to take years to mature, but it's a starting point, and Europe needs a starting point on this, and there's a lot of promise behind the initiative.
Yeah, it's very exciting. So next time we'll come back and you're going to tell us a little bit about use cases in more detail and customer journeys and
opportunity.
And opportunities. And myself and Adam were talking about how we could I'm very visual, so I sent Adam when I worked with my colleagues in the HSE with incredible technical colleagues that understood all the decentralization. We done a lot of drawing on whiteboards. So I was saying what we might do for the next one for use cases and customer journeys is have the conversation, but we'll pop up some examples of what that looks from a visual perspective. For people to get their head around it. And maybe it's just me, but I don't think it was. We needed to look at this quite a few times to really wrap your brain around how the process changes, and the more you get your brain around that, the more opportunities you actually see for multiple businesses as well, which is exciting. So next time, that's what we're going to do. Thank you so much for coming to the first installment talking about the European Digital Identity Wallet. And if we didn't explain it, a 3-letter acronym, a TLA. You're having 3-letter acronyms for 3-letter acronyms. Let us know, and we'll put it on the LinkedIn as well. Thanks very much.
Thank you.